The philosophical movement known as Stoicism emerged at the dawn of the Hellenistic period of the ancient world. This was a time of massive political change, and understanding the general history of this period accounts for how it was that philosophy, including Stoicism, spread so quickly around the Mediterranean. In the time of Socrates and Plato, Greek cities were autonomous states, and while they banded together to fight against the Persians, the Greeks lacked a central government, and conflict between cities frequently resurfaced once the Persians were no longer a threat. But the middle of the 4th century brought a massive political upheaval thanks to Alexander the Great. When Alexander took the throne at the age of 20, Macedonia was effectively a backwater in northern Greece. Alexander was tutored by none other than Aristotle himself, and, incredibly, in just over a decade, Alexander had conquered the better part of the known world, and his empire stretched from Greece to Egypt, through all of Persia to the borders of India. After his death, however, Alexander's empire divided into smaller kingdoms, ruled over by his quarreling generals. Nonetheless, Alexander's influence was felt insofar as Greek language, education, and philosophy was spread across the eastern Mediterranean. It is because of Alexander the Great that Greek became the common tongue. He's why the New Testament is written in Greek, and why it is that philosophers well into the Roman Empire, including Marcus Aurelius, still wrote philosophy in Greek. And while in the middle of the 4th century, Athens was still the best city in the world to study philosophy, Alexander had laid the foundations for this Greek invention to spread, and it would not be long before Rhodes, Alexandria, and eventually Rome itself would become prominent centers of philosophy and learning. Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium. Now, where he's from is actually important because we don't want to get him confused with Zeno of Elea, who's the one who's famous for Zeno's philosophical paradoxes. Now, Citium was a Phoenician city on the island of Cyprus in the middle of the Mediterranean. Zeno was there a wealthy merchant, and how he came to philosophy was apparently after he became shipwrecked, and then eventually made it to Athens, where he went to a bookstore and found Xenophon's Memorabilia. Now, other than Plato, Xenophon is our main source for Socrates' philosophy, and in this work, Xenophon portrays Socrates in a way that Zeno found particularly appealing, and Zeno then asked, well, where can I find men like this? Now, it just so happened that the philosopher who the bookseller pointed Zeno to was the Cynic philosopher Crates. Now, Cynicism is a philosophical movement in its own right, but what's important for understanding Stoicism is that Cynicism emphasizes the importance of living in accordance with nature as opposed to what's merely conventional, and that what's ultimately in accordance with nature for us as human beings is to live in accordance with reason. So one thing led to another, and Zeno ended up developing a system of philosophy that survived for at least 500 years in its own right, and that was the major school of philosophy well into the 1st century AD. The most important Stoic philosophers are the first 3 heads of the Stoic school: Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus. Chrysippus was an especially brilliant and talented philosopher, and we are told that he wrote over 800 books. Sadly, none of those books have come down to us, except in fragmented testimony from other authors. If a genie asked me to pick one author's works to recover from the ashes of history, I would, without hesitation, choose Chrysippus. Historical fantasies aside, the first 3 heads of the Stoa constitute Orthodox Stoicism, or early Stoicism. In the next phase of the school, known as Middle Stoicism, the most important figures are Panaetius and Posidonius. Again, we don't have any of their books, so scholarship here is controversial, but we are fortunate to have a large portion of Panaetius' ethical thinking preserved, as Cicero's text, De Officiis, which translates to on duties or on appropriate actions, explicitly works from one of Panaetius' books. In this course, however, we will focus on Roman Stoicism, represented by Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. We are fortunate in that their texts have been entirely preserved, and so they are much easier to read than the earlier Stoic fragments. These texts have an intensely practical focus and are thus excellent sources for understanding how Stoicism is not just theoretical philosophy, but a way of life. So why are the Stoics such a big deal, and what did they actually believe? Well, in the first place, the Stoics invented propositional logic. They made major contributions in that field, and it's clear that they were devout dialecticians. They studied dialectic and they studied logic very closely. They were also some of the first explicit proponents of the position that's now known as compatibilism in the debates about free will and moral responsibility. The Stoics think that the laws of nature, in fact, uniquely determine the course of human history, but nonetheless, people are rightly held responsible for their actions, even though they couldn't have done otherwise. In terms of ethics, the Stoics defended what's known as the sufficiency thesis, which is the thesis that virtue is necessary and indeed sufficient for living a happy life. What this means is that only the virtuous are happy, and every virtuous person is happy. So virtue, in that sense, is the key to living a happy life. They're also egalitarians about happiness in the sense that they think that anybody can become virtuous, and thus happiness is always within our power. It's always up to us whether or not we live a happy life. In terms of politics, the Stoics were cosmopolitans. They were some of the first figures to defend the thesis that our moral and ethical obligations extend beyond the family, extend even beyond our own city, but to all other human beings. Every human being, insofar as they are rational, is worthy of our moral concern. Finally, the Stoics are sometimes hailed as the first defenders of what we might now call cognitive behavioral therapy. This is the idea that your affect and your behavior is primarily determined by the beliefs that you have. So if you can fix your maladaptive beliefs, if you can change the way that you think, you change the way that you live your life. And thus philosophy, insofar as it works on our beliefs and tries to improve our belief structure, is also the key to living a happy life.